In this very brief tutorial, I'm going to show you quickly what makes the difference of a volunteer that works in biomed and a volunteer that does not work in biomed. This demonstration is to show why you may not be able to schedule a volunteer for a blood drive, or why a volunteer cannot schedule themselves for a blood drive. So let's look at a profile right now of a volunteer who's almost there. So if we look at this Judy person here, Judy is scheduled, her position is blood drive volunteer trainee. Now we know that from previous discussions that the position of blood drive volunteer trainee is not the same thing as a donor ambassador. And donor ambassadors are the people who go out on blood drives. So what we need to do is we need to change her position from being blood drive volunteer trainee to donor ambassador. So on the right-hand side, we can go down to positions, and that will quickly jump us to the part of the profile that shows us her positions. Now, Judy only has one position, and the position is blood drive volunteer trainee. That was a position that we used to have that we no longer use. And so what we want to do is we want to, rather than end dating this position and adding another position and mucking up the volunteer's profile, what we want to do is we want to just change the position that she had into the position into the right position that we created. So what we want to do is we want to go to Edit. And once we're in Edit, we'll see that it gives us the name of the position, and it does have a start date. And it's very important that we leave the start date alone because it does give us an indication of when this volunteer started volunteering with us as a blood drive volunteer. And what we do is we go to her position, and we select the drop-down box. In that drop-down box, you'll see there's a position that says Blood Drive Donor Ambassador. You want to select that, and then you want to go ahead and click Submit. And now if we scroll all the way up to the top of the page again, and we look at Judy's profile, we'll see that it says the position Blood Drive Donor Ambassador, and that's what we need to have. Now, in order for Julie to register herself for blood drives, or in order for her to show up in our lists when we're trying to schedule a blood drive, she needs to have a county assigned to her profile. Now, don't get this confused with the county that's in their profile under the address section. This is something a little bit different. It needs to go into the specific section called Biomedical Volunteer. So we can see that if that information is there by clicking on the Biomedical Volunteer button there. And again, it's going to jump in her profile down a little ways and show us her Biomedical Volunteer section. Now, if we look here, it does say that she's part of the Connecticut, that she does have a county assigned to her, which is Hartford County, which happens to be the one that she's in. So we're all set. We don't need to make any changes. At this point, Judy can go ahead and schedule herself for blood drives, and we can schedule her for blood drives. Now let's look at another volunteer. This volunteer already has a position that we don't want to change, but we do want to add a position to their profile. Let's go ahead and go to his profile. His name is Mike Sharon. So Mike here, if we look at his positions on the very top of his profile section, it does say that he's part of Biomedical Services, he's a volunteer trainer, and that he also does International Services Restoring Family Links caseworker. Now we want to keep those positions right where they are because he's still going to be doing all of that stuff the same. However, we do need to add that he's going to also be a blood drive donor ambassador. Now we do that by going to positions, again like we did before, and we can see again the list of positions that are here. Now if one of these were wrong, we could go ahead and change it, but again both of these positions are going to stay current. So what we want to do is go ahead and click on Add New Position. This is going to have the same Add Edit Position box from before, and this is where you go ahead and select Blood Drive Donor Ambassador from the drop-down box, as we did last time. We want to give it a start date of today. Now, if you do know when this volunteer actually started volunteering at blood drives, I recommend that you use that date. However, for the most part, because I don't know when Mike actually started being a donor ambassador, I'm going to use today's date. And then we'll go ahead and click Submit. Now, when we go back to their profile, we see that it now says Blood Drive Donor Ambassador on their profile and that they have a start date of today. Now, once that position has been added, it does take up to 1 hour for the profile to update with this information. So the next thing we want to do is let's look at Mike's profile and see if he has the information for blood drive donor ambassador, rather biomedical volunteer. So if we click on Biomedical Volunteer, we'll see that right now that there are no counties added to his profile. See it right here. So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and edit profile. We want to click on Add County. And since he lives in the Hartford County, we're going to go ahead and select the state, CT, and the county, we're going to select Hartford. And then click Add. Now, if we know that we're about to schedule this person, Mike, for a blood drive in a county other than Hartford, we want to go ahead and add that county at this time. The more counties a person has, the more blood drives they're available to volunteer at. Always make sure that once you're finished selecting and adding the county, you click the Submit button. So at this time, Mike Sharon's profile says that he works as a volunteer trainer, and he works also as a blood drive donor ambassador and an International Services Restoring Family Links caseworker. So he's all set and ready to go. All right, the next type of volunteer that we can find that may not be able to register for blood drives, we have a few more types. The first type is a general volunteer that doesn't have the position of blood drive donor ambassador. And I want you to see a couple things here. First of all, if we look at our profile, it does have a nice box at top here that's letting us know that this member does not have an email on file. This is something that we generally try to avoid, as our main method of communication with our volunteers is via email. So at some point, someone should reach out to this volunteer and find out what their email address is so we can go ahead and update that information. All right, the next thing we have to do is look at this, see how there's 0 positions here. Not even a position of blood drive donor ambassador at all. So at this time, what we need to do is add the position the same as we normally would. So you're going to go ahead and, again, go down to your positions. And you can see that this person did have the position of blood drive volunteer trainee at one point, but it had an end date, meaning that the position is no longer active. So at this time, if we look at this profile, we say, well, this person has no active positions. Everything in here has been removed. So let's go ahead and look at one of the comments and find out, maybe this will give us some information as to why. Nope, all it says is GF. And that's Ginger. No real information. So let's see if there's any activity notes to tell us kind of what happened with this person. So if we go to the top, if we click on activities, we do see that there's an activity here, but all it is that Ginny Brenza had entered the person's learning and management account ID. Now, typically, if we inactivate a volunteer, we do need to add activities to the profile to tell us why we're inactivating the volunteer. So let's go ahead and do a little bit more research on this volunteer and see why this volunteer has no email on file and has no positions that are currently active. So if we go ahead and go down to the very last part on the left-hand side for the first column, it says volunteer/employee status. If we click on that, here's kind of what we're finding out. This is kind of going to be our trail to figure out what happened. So it looks like the person was a prospective volunteer back in May of 2013. Then they became a general volunteer. It looks like in June of 2013. Then in March of 2014, she was inactivated. Again, no comments, so that's one of the reasons we have to make sure that we really strive to put comments in everything that we do on Volunteer Connection so that we have an understanding of what's happening. And then it looks like back in 7/18 of 2014, this person was reactivated as a general volunteer. And it says, per Hyla Handler. So at this point, what we would need to do is, looks like what happened was this person was a disaster volunteer. Looking at their former positions, they were a disaster volunteer. They probably stopped, didn't want to do disaster anymore, but now they're still interested in doing blood drives, so we went ahead and reactivated her account. Unfortunately, we didn't reactivate her position as a blood drive donor ambassador, so she actually has no positions. And this is a real issue for us. And at some point, there are cleanups that are done, and these people will end up being re-inactivated. So we do want to make sure that we're catching as many of these as possible. So let's go ahead all the way back up at the top again and go back to positions. All right, and again, we want to try to keep the profile as clean as possible. We don't want to muddy up the profile with too many positions and adding this one and ending that one and so forth. So what we want to do is, again, we realize that there's 2 problems with this line. First of all, the blood drive volunteer trainee, that's not an actual position. So what that really should say is blood drive donor ambassador. And we also see that there's an end date here, so we know that the position isn't active. So what we want to do is go ahead and click on the Edit button. And just as we did with the other blood drive volunteer training before, we want to go ahead and select the actual position, which should be blood drive donor ambassador. And when there's an end date, we need to remove that end date. But before we do, I want to just make a note of when it was inactivated before. So that way there we can kind of go back to put our notes in about why we're doing what we're doing. So here in the notes section, this is why we want to make sure that we're adding as much information as possible. And when you can expand the column, expand the box with this little box right here, you don't have to though. If you leave it small, it'll continue to type. You just can't see everything you're typing. So I like to make it big when I'm typing. So I'm going to put in looks like volunteer was activated by ES, which is Emergency Services, or DS, Disaster Services. However, still volunteers at blood drives. Let's see. The volunteers blood drive position was ended date I'm just going to, because we are in the U.S. and we like to do things differently from almost every other country, so I'm going to go ahead and put it in our format. Okay, so that's so I made a note about what I'm doing. I'm also going to go ahead and do one more line to say why I'm making this person what they're making them. So I'm going to say reactivating blood drive position. There's no such word as reactivating, so we have to just make a number. There we go. Okay, and then as with every note, you always want to make sure that you tell everyone who it is in case there's any additional questions. So you want to put a dash, and then you just want to put your initials. Mine are MJG. So now at this point, if I were to hit submit on this, the person would have the appropriate position, but there would still be an end date. So we need to remove this end date so the position becomes active. Now there's a nice little X next to the calendar feature here. So if we click on that X, it will remove the end date. And with a blank end date, we now know, because we have documentation that it wasn't at one point, we now know that this position is going to become this person's active position. So if we click submit, and we look at their positions, we can see that there's one position, blood drive donor ambassador, and that it's started back in 2013, March of 2013. I'm sorry, June 2013. And we can see that there's little notes. Now there's a view button there, and we can view the notes that I put in. So it looks like, so we can have that information, that running tab of what's happening. So here's the information. So now this person is a general volunteer. We can see in their employees, the volunteer status, they're a general volunteer, which is good. It's what we need. And they have the position of blood drive donor ambassadors. If we go all the way back up to the top of their page, you can see here that we're back in business. The profile says their name. It has their status as a general volunteer, and it does have a position of blood drive donor ambassador. And with any blood drive donor ambassador, as we mentioned before, we do have to add the section that tells us what counties they want to work in. So again, we're going to go ahead and click on Biomedical Volunteer, click on the Edit Profile button. One of the things I like to do, because we are adding this person, you can look at their primary address to find out what county they're in. So she lives in Farmington, which is Hartford County. So if I go right down here, conveniently, right after primary address is Biomedical Volunteer, we can go ahead and click Add County. State will be Connecticut, and adding Hartford. And again, nothing will save unless you click Submit. Now it is saying that this person needed an email. So what probably happened was this volunteer was imported into the system, and for some reason, no email was provided. So what we need to do is we need to give the email address of noemail@redcross.org. We do want to make sure we make a note, though, to have somebody contact this volunteer at some point to make sure to get their real email address and make sure that they understand why it is so important that they have it, because it is our primary method of communications. And then we can go ahead and click Submit now. Profile will update, and now that we've put an email address, even though it's incorrect in email address, we'll see that the box at top has gone away that says no email address on file. So it looks like we're all set to go. So this volunteer is good to go. Next volunteer we have is Miss Caitlin here. So Caitlin does have a position of blood drive donor ambassador, but she's not a general volunteer. She's still what we call a prospective volunteer. So what probably happened was somebody accepted her as a blood drive donor ambassador before she had finished all of her intake steps. So let's go ahead and look and see what's happening with this profile. So if we scroll down just a little ways, we can look and see that her login information looks like this person has never logged in. So there's no last login date, and we're still getting the information to send the link to the volunteer because they've never activated their profile. So what this says to me is that the volunteer received an email at some point by us saying, hey, you now have a volunteer connection account, and was asked to click on the link to authorize their account, and they never did. Now at this point what we can do is we can send this person another email to remind her of this. And basically all it's going to do is send her a basic email that says, hey, you have a volunteer connection account, please activate it using this link here. Now it does give us the link as an administrator so you can see what activation link they are going to get. So if you do have any questions or problems, or if they have a problem getting through, or if you want to write your own email and include the link, this is what you would want to include in the email. I know that this was some templates set up through national and through the region. So this is, again, the link that you would be adding to that template email when you send it over to Caitlin. So that's the information we have about Caitlin. She's a prospective volunteer, and she has not yet activated her profile, meaning she's never logged into the system. Another telltale sign that she's never logged in is that her username is still a string of numbers. When you first log in, when you use that activation email that you get, when you activate your account, it'll ask you to choose a new username and select a password. So that's another good indicator that this person has not yet activated their account because their username is still just numbers. So at this point what's going to happen is because she was given the position of blood drive donor ambassador, and she's technically a prospective volunteer, she should have never gotten that position of blood drive donor ambassador. So let's go ahead and look and find out what happened and what information we can find about this. I'm guessing that she was an import from the initial import that we did, but just to be sure, let's go ahead and look at her status. No, looks like she actually was a prospective volunteer all the way back in 2013. She was made inactive on, looks like just November of 2014. SF is Sue Fournier. She's one of our intake team members. But she went back to being a prospective volunteer in March, actually today. So she's back to being a prospective volunteer. So we want to make sure that we're reaching out to her and getting her to activate that profile as soon as possible. Okay? So we can't really do very much with this person right now. It does show that she's a donor ambassador, but she's been a donor ambassador since 2012. So we're going to leave the position there. Even though it doesn't quite work, we still can't assign her to a blood drive because she's still a prospective volunteer. So let's go ahead and leave that alone for now. The next person we have here is Crystal. And so this Crystal was a person that she started the intake process, but she hasn't finished it yet. Now we can see that there's no position here. We don't know much. She's actually a brandy new volunteer. And so what I want to show you with Crystal's profile here is what the intake step includes. So it looks like she started her application. She logged into the system on 3/9 of 15. If the person wasn't an import, if the person actually created their profile themselves, we see that there's no longer that link that says click here to resend an email, and it doesn't give us the link that they're going to get in the email. It rather just it tells us what their username is, and it shows us the last time they logged in. So if you look over here on the left-hand side, it shows us their intake path, meaning what steps have they completed so far. So it looks like they've registered. They have not yet registered for an orientation. That is a user step, meaning the user has to do that. That's not something we can do for them. But once she registers for an orientation and she attends the orientation, during that, right before she attends the orientation, once she confirms that she's going to be coming to the orientation, we will process her background check. Now, we won't do the background checks until after it's confirmed that they're coming, because it does cost the Red Cross donor does cost the Red Cross money for each background check. Okay, so that's the information on Julia. Hopefully, this person, Crystal will activate her account soon, and we'll be able to go from there. The next person we have is John. John is an inactive volunteer, meaning that he was made inactive for some reason or another. Let's go ahead and look at John's profile a little bit. Well, I can tell you right away by looking at this login information that he never activated his Red Cross account. You can see that information right here. Okay, so that's probably the reason he became inactive, but let's go ahead and see what other information we can find about this John character here. Now, this does give me reason to pause. So if I'm looking at this account, I do see that that John has a position of blood drive donor ambassador, which again doesn't make much sense considering he's an inactive volunteer, and he was probably made inactive because he never activated his volunteer connection account. And look, there's no orientation on file, so I'm imagining it's probably because he never did an orientation like he was supposed to. However, if I look at this section right here, it does say SABA LMS information. So SABA, as you may or may not know, is the learning management system for the American Red Cross, primarily used by Preparedness, Health and Safety, and Disaster Services. So it looks like he has a SABA ID, and that the SABA ID has actually been validated. Now, generally we don't do that until the volunteer becomes a part of the disaster services or actually has done some sort of training in the Red Cross. So let's continue to go and do a little bit of information, but that does give me a reason to pause as we continue to scroll down. Looks like the person never entered any emergency contact information, which is a requirement for all volunteers as well. Looks like they were a volunteer since 2009. They were given a member number, but they never finished the profile, so they weren't given the rest of the information that they were supposed to have. And if we continue to scroll down, looks like he was an import. So if it says volunteer screening, and then if it says imported next to it, that means that the person was originally dumped into volunteer connection, probably back in 2012 when we did the initial volunteer dump. So if we continue to scroll down at his profile here, let's see what other information we can find. Looks like he never applied for any opportunities, but he had the position of blood drive donor ambassador, and it was started back in 2012. Now, because he's an inactive volunteer, technically this position should be inactivated. This position should be ended. It should no longer be active. So what we need to do, at some point that position should have been inactive, because what we're seeing now is that he's an inactive volunteer with an active position. So that kind of doesn't go hand in hand. It doesn't jive, if you get my drift. So if we look at this volunteer's position, they have the position of blood drive donor ambassador, and they shouldn't. So if we look at go down to their positions, this position should have been end dated. So we're going to go ahead and click on edit, and we're going to go ahead and give it an end date of today's date. And we're again always going to make sure that we put in our notes. And again, every note ends with a dash and then your initials, and then submit. Okay, so now this person is what they're supposed to be, which is actually supposed to be an inactive prospective volunteer. We have our notes, so he's no longer showing as having a position because he's not active. So we're good with that. And that is pretty much the bulk of the list. Those are the real reasons, again. So the main things you want to look at when you're looking at a member profile to find out if you can or cannot schedule them for a blood drive would be to look at their status to see if they're a general volunteer, to look at their position to make sure that they have a position called blood drive donor ambassador, and then to look at their biomedical volunteer section and make sure that there is a section in here, a county added to their profile, so that we know that they are in fact what areas they want to volunteer in, do blood drives in. Okay, I hope you found this video informative. If you do have any questions, feel free to send me an email at any time. My email is mike.grimmer@redcross.org, and that's mike.grimmer@redcross.org. Thank you very much, and have a great day.